Connected by purpose, driven by passion. This is Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series.
Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank our Keystone funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities, including this Spark Live webinar series. Spark Live is where we gather each week to curate, convene, and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community. Our goal is to spark conversation, ideas, and action. There are two options to join in on the live conversation. Questions and comments for our panel or presenters can be typed into the question box, and comments that you wish to share with the audience can be typed into the chat box, visible to all of our attendees. For those of you on Twitter, tag @ChildHealthCan on any webinar-related tweet or use the hashtag SparkLive. And to keep up to date on all of Children's Healthcare Canada's webinars and other activities, be sure to sign up for our Spark Bulletin by visiting our website at childhealthcan.ca.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. Children's Healthcare Canada acknowledges that our offices, located in Ottawa, are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions that Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community, our province, and the country. Today, we're delighted to bring you Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder, a Canadian lens. This is the first webinar of a three-part webinar series related to the Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Peter Zatmari is the Chief of the Mental Health Collaborative at the Hospital for Sick Children, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and the University of Toronto. He's interested in ways in which autism spectrum disorder and children with it grow and develop, and how we can maximize their potential with collaborative interventions. Dr. Isabel Smith is a professor and Joan and Jack Craig Chair in Autism Research in the Department of Pediatrics at Dalhousie University. As a clinical developmental psychologist, she is interested in early identification, early development, and the evolving presentation of autism spectrum disorder. Another major interest is in developing and evaluating interventions to improve quality of life for children and youth with ASD and their families. Just a reminder that we record all our webinars. As mentioned in the introductory video, please type your questions into the question box at any time, and I'll prompt you via the chat as well. And I'll pose your questions to our guests at the end of the presentations. It's now my pleasure to pass the mic to Peter.
Thank you very much, Paula. It's lovely to be here and to welcome you all to the first of the three webinars on kids with autism spectrum disorder, their pathways in Canada. I want to particularly thank Children's Healthcare Canada for giving the Pathways team this opportunity to present some of our results. We feel it's really important to share the results of this study quite widely in order to give a profile of what's happening to kids with ASD in Canada. We have two other webinars that are coming up later, and the dates, we'll give the dates at the end. One is today is a Canadian lens, which is really just an introduction to the study. The second one is on strengths and assets from multiple perspectives. And the final one is on mental health risk and resilience in kids with ASD. Next slide, please. The Pathways Project originated as a patient-oriented research program. We sort of stumbled on this concept even before the notion of patient-oriented research became as popular as it has in recent years. In the years 2000 to 2004, we held a number of stakeholder conferences to summarize the evidence on early intervention and screening in kids with ASD and to identify different evidence gaps. From those conferences, all the stakeholders, which included parents, clinicians, people with autism, and policymakers identified 10 research questions that they wanted to have answers for that were relevant to a Canadian context. We then had a process of identifying the top question. Wasn't very fancy. We gave everybody $10,000 worth of Monopoly money and asked them to put their money on the question that they most wanted to have answered. And the top question was, what are the factors associated with a good outcome in ASD? Actually, we found this a little surprising. It wasn't a question that we thought people would want answered, but we went with it. We submitted a grant to CIHR in 2004, and it was funded as the Pathway Study, and we're lucky enough to have the study funded continuously, except for a little break in between, now until the year 2022. Next slide. It's important to emphasize that the study is national in scope. In other words, we recruited kids with ASD between 2 and 5 years of age in Halifax, Montreal, Hamilton, Edmonton, and Vancouver. So this gives us almost a pan-Canadian perspective. We followed the kids from their point of diagnosis, as I say, between 2 and 5 years of age, through the preschool years, through the school years, and through to the end of adolescence. Next slide. One of the ways which we were different, and this is the largest follow-up study of kids with ASD in the world, is that we very much took an ecological approach. In other words, we were not only interested in factors within the individual that might influence outcome or how the kids were doing over time, but we were also interested in family factors, what services they received, what their school experiences were like, what kind of community they lived in, trying to put all of this together into a comprehensive approach, identifying factors associated with a good outcome. Next slide, please. There are 3 phases to Pathway. So phase 1 was from 2004 to 9. Time 1, or when we started the study, was just after the kids got a diagnosis of ASD. And then you can see here on this slide what the different time points were. We focused at this phase on their baseline skills and abilities and ASD symptoms, some measures of their mental health, looking quite a bit at family factors and stress. Next slide. Phase 2, which went up to 2014, and again, here you can see the 4 time points and the different ages or the spacing of the assessments for those time points. Phase 2, now because the kids were in school, we were able to collect information from teachers. We also had information on their academic outcomes, and we spent more time focusing on their mental health outcomes, like anxiety and depression, and having a look at the services that they've received. Next slide. And now we're in phase 3. It'll end in 2022. And of course, during this phase, the pandemic happened. And so we've tried to incorporate the impact of the pandemic on the lives of kids with ASD as well. So by the time this phase of the study will be over, the kids will be 18 years of age, and we will have seen them at 12 different points in time. And the focus for phase 3 is really on their developmental health, which we mean to include not only their mental health, but their independent living skills, their physical health, and their social functioning. And also, we're very interested in the transition to early adulthood. Next slide. A key aspect of the study is that we collect information by multiple methods and from multiple informants. So parents can report on their children, and they report on their own mental health and stress levels. We have direct observation of the children and testing of their language skills and their cognitive skills, for example. We get teacher reports on how the kids are functioning in school and what their emotional health is like in school. And then we have parent interviews that collect a wide range of information on a variety of different topics. Next slide. So here is a slide that illustrates the pathway participants. As you can see, we've recruited subjects from Halifax, Montreal, Hamilton, Edmonton, and Vancouver. Most of the subjects came from Montreal, but we have a good representation from different sites across the country. Provinces with very different policies in how kids with ASD are, what services they receive, and what kind of school experiences they have. The middle frame here gives an indication of what their cognitive ability is and their language scores. This indicates that this is a representative sample. This is what you would see with a representative sample of kids with ASD. Remember that the kids were enrolled between the ages of 2 and 4 years, 11 months. So we enrolled them at an age of roughly 3.3 years. And they're very close to when they were diagnosed. So this was really important to us, that we would enroll them in the study right after they were diagnosed so that we could capture the full range of experiences that the kids would have after their diagnosis. And here's the proportion of boys and girls, which is fairly typical of what a sample of ASD kids would look like at this age. Next slide, please. One of the first areas of interest was the age of diagnosis. We know that this is a topic of huge concern for parents and policymakers and clinicians internationally. The average age where the kids got a diagnosis in the Pathway study was 39 years of age. While that looks pretty good, we have to remember that that's roughly a year and a half after the parents first became concerned about one aspect of their child's development. Also, we found interesting variation in the average age of diagnosis across the different provinces. Roughly speaking, kids in British Columbia and Nova Scotia were about 4 months older than kids who got a diagnosis in the province of Quebec and Montreal. Alberta and Ontario didn't differ from the kids in Quebec. Probably the most important factor that was associated with an earlier diagnosis was lower intellectual level and lower language ability. This is consistent with the literature indicating that cognitive ability and language ability are markers by which people get into service and get a diagnosis. Some other factors that have been identified in the United States, for example, which has a different kind of healthcare system, some of these other factors we found were not related to the age of diagnosis, like the children's sex, their social communications, symptoms, behavioral problems, or particular family factors like income and education. Can we improve upon the age of diagnosis? It's a tricky question. Remember, while the kids were, we diagnosed them at a relatively young age, the sample here is circumscribed because we could only include kids up to 5 years of age. And the kids were all recruited through academic centers where kids with autism were referred. So while 3+ years may seem young, the key issue is that parents had concerns very much earlier. And so we have to be sensitive to seeing ways in which that we can lower the age of diagnosis. And this would mean, I think, greater surveillance efforts needed to detect children who show some kind of high-risk markers of ASD, like early language delay or some mental health challenges, temperamental difficulties, et cetera, et cetera. And also there's wide variation across the country in the standards for diagnosis and the way it's done. So we really need national, interprovincial, and territorial collaboration to improve these early identification efforts. Let me pass it on now to Isabel to talk about language.
Thanks, Peter. So one of the really important milestones for families we know is that their children, when their children will start to communicate. And we know that in individuals with autism spectrum disorder, that the development of spoken language is a good predictor of later success in sort of the academic world and in independent living. So with that in mind, we wanted to look at what language development was like in the Pathways children who had delayed language at age 3. And in particular, there's a recent focus on children who don't develop much language, so-called minimally verbal children. And so that was a particular focus for us. So next slide. In a study that was led by an American collaborator, Vanessa Ball, we explored the language development of Pathways children who showed delayed language at age 3. And what you can see here is, based on how delayed their language was at age 3, what percentage of the children became verbal by age 11. So for children who had at least 5 words at age 3, 96% of those kids became verbal by the time they were 11. But if they had only between 1 and 4 words, it was smaller. And for children who had no words at age 3, which is a very worrying sign, only about half of those children were verbal by age 11. We also wanted to look at what other skills that have been associated with the growth of language, both in typical development and in kids with ASD, were associated with kids' verbal development. And those were things like their nonverbal and verbal skill levels at age 3, their fine and gross motor skills, their social attention, and their imitation skills. Next slide. So what you see here is that of all of these indicators, the thing that we saw that was most predictive of children's language development was their fine motor skills. So what you see on the left-hand side is that children with the red line who had extremely delayed fine motor skills at age 3 were the children who are most likely to remain minimally verbal by age 11. So you can see those paths diverging by the time children are about 4.5. If we compare on the right-hand side to the children's ability to initiate social attention at age 3, we don't see that difference. So it was these extreme fine motor delays that were the most significant sign. This was consistent with some other findings. The great strength of this study, though, was this effect was first looked at in our American collaborators' data set from a longitudinal study in the US, and then replicated in the Pathway study, which gives us a lot of confidence in the finding. A possible mechanism for this is that perhaps children with very poor motor skills early on don't interact in the same way with objects and toys in the environment, and that might interfere with both solo and social play that might subsequently affect language development. So it's an important area to focus on. Next slide. What other aspects of autism were we interested in, and how do these unfold in early childhood? Well, we explored many, but one really influential paper that Peter led looked at the developmental course of autism symptoms and everyday adaptive behavior, adaptive functioning, sort of daily living skills and so forth in kids with autism, and looked at the course of those symptoms measured by clinicians and by parents over the course of the preschool years. So this would correspond to phase 1 of our study as Peter described it. Next slide. So the statistical analysis that we did here grouped together children in terms of the patterns of change of their symptoms over time. So what you see here are 2 lines representing different groups of children. And it reflects the change in the severity of their autism symptoms, so that a higher score means more severe symptoms. What you see is that the larger group were the children who had relatively more severe symptoms of autism, and those symptoms were stable over time. There was a second group of children who had relatively lower symptoms, and those actually improved or declined over time. So what did we see with adaptive behavior? Next slide. Here we saw that the children's scores fell into 3 groups. The everyday adaptive behavior of the largest group of children are the ones shown in the middle here. About half of the children had sort of moderate levels of adaptive functioning, and it's slightly improved over time. Then you can see on the bottom line rather, in red, there is a group of children who had relatively lower everyday functioning that declined slightly over time. And on the top, in purple, is a group of children who had relatively high adaptive functioning, relatively strong adaptive behavior that actually improved over time. So what happens when you look at those trajectories together? Next slide. Do the children with more severe symptoms necessarily show lower adaptive functioning? Well, no. Here are the 6 possible patterns that we saw. And it's a little bit to wrap your head around, but if you look at the bar graph on the right, it shows you on the x-axis in terms of autism symptoms, the first group with the less severe symptoms and the second group with the more severe symptoms. And then the colored bars tell you where those children fell in terms of their adaptive functioning. And I'll just draw your attention first to the largest group of children on the right-hand side and the middle bar, that blue bar. Those are the children who had more severe and stable autism symptoms and moderate levels of adaptive functioning. So they were almost half of that group. On the left-hand side, I'll draw your attention to the sort of turquoise bar of the children who had less severe autism symptoms that improved and who also had higher levels of adaptive functioning that also improved. So those would be the kids you would think of as possibly the kind of optimal outcomes. Next slide. So what? Well, one of the things this tells us is that it's too simplistic to think about high or low functioning. Those aren't really appropriate or useful terms to apply because we see that children have different levels of development in different domains. And so individual children's rates of improvement or development vary tremendously. We also saw that these trajectories tend to diverge over time. That is, kids are more similar at very early in life and become more different over time. It also tells us really that prediction of outcomes is pretty complex. We don't have a silver crystal ball that we can look at when children are first diagnosed that'll tell us what path that they're on. Next slide. Our group has also looked at the family context. So as you'll recall, Peter showed that ecological model. We look at the individual child level. We can also look at the child in the family. So we know that parenting is really hard work, and we know that parents of children with developmental differences tend to report higher levels of stress. It's certainly true for mothers. It's probably also true to fathers, although we have less research in that area. In the pathway study, the majority of our parent respondents were mothers, so I'm going to be speaking primarily about mothers here. In a couple of papers led by our pathways team member, Anat Zayed, we looked at children with autism who were experiencing behavioral difficulties and how this affected their mother's stress and vice versa. We also looked at how resources available affected stress. So next slide. So mothers self-reported on 2 kinds of stress that they might experience. One is general distress, so just the stresses of everyday life related to finances, one's own health, whatever. And then also sources of stress specifically related to parenting. Parents also reported on whether or not their children showed particular kinds of behavior problems, that sort of inward directed problems like anxiety or outward directed problems like aggression. And once again, we looked across time, from the time of diagnosis and through the preschool years. What we found was that over time, mothers' general levels of distress and children's behavior were quite stable. But we found that mothers whose children had high levels of problem behavior of whatever kind showed higher general distress, but But the effect didn't go both ways. Higher problem behavior in the child did not lead necessarily to greater general distress for mothers. That's unlike what we saw with parenting stress, where there was a cycle of high parenting distress was related to high problem behavior in the children and vice versa. So that cycle was more consistent. Next slide. So what about that? Well, parents who report either kind of stress require support, both for their own mental health and because the stress that they experience could interfere with their ability to promote their children's well-being. So, a corollary of this would be that parents need to be provided with resources to help manage children's problem behavior without that intervention being made to feel, making parents feel guilty or inadequate, because that's going to certainly increase their distress. Next slide. So the next question that Anat and our other colleagues looked at was how the availability of resources affected mother stress. And here we looked at two different kinds of resources. One is mother's personal resources, and that is the kinds of coping strategies they used when they were faced with adversity. And that can be framed as two different kinds of coping strategy. One that's sort of more active, engaged, facing the problem, focusing on how to make things better. The second kind of coping strategy is a less effective one, in which one disengages, becomes emotional, and isn't addressing the problem directly. The other resources that we examined in this study were the social resources available to families, and those were whether families were functioning well, sort of in terms of the marital relationship, whether the family was a cohesive unit, and also the informal social supports that were available to families. So this would be friends, family, so not formal services, but just more sort of community and personal connections. Next slide. So what did we see here? So at the time of the child's diagnosis of autism, we saw that children's externalizing behavior problems were associated with more stress for parents. Also, greater levels of family dysfunction and the reliance on coping strategies that weren't very effective also led to more parent stress. On the other hand, we saw that informal social supports, so support from friends and family, and the use of those active problem-focused coping strategies were associated with lower levels of parent stress. Interestingly, we didn't see any relationship between the stress that the mothers were experiencing and the kinds of risk factors that we would often think of as being associated with greater stress, like employment status or income. Next slide. Then in this study, we looked 2 years later at the same relationships. So there was still no association between how stressed mothers were feeling and those socioeconomic risk factors, which was interesting. In general, parents who were highly stressed at time 1 were still experiencing high stress at time 2. But what we saw was that if the level of social support that parents were reporting increased over those 2 years, that was associated with a decrease in parent stress. And on the converse side, if over those 2 years family dysfunction increased or mothers used more of those disengaged, ineffective coping strategies or showed a less use of the more active and effective coping strategies, both of those things were associated with higher parent stress. So parent stress does interact with children's behavior problems. But the important point here is that parent stress can change. It can either decrease or increase or decrease, and that isn't really so much associated with child-related or socioeconomic risk factors as it is with things that can change, so that we can provide interventions that help families change in ways that will show a will be associated with decreased stress. So to teach active coping skills, strategies such as mindfulness interventions or cognitive behavioral approaches can be very effective in teaching those skills. Group interventions can provide informal social support, either in-person groups or, as we've learned during the pandemic, even online groups can provide really effective means of social support that can make a real difference for families. Marital or family counseling can address family dysfunction when that's present and is a source of stress for families. So all of those interventions are things that should be offered to families of young children with autism when they're experiencing distress related to their child's development. Next slide. This is back to Peter.
Thanks, Isabel. So just some key messages from the Pathways study as a kind of a summary. I hope that you've come to appreciate that this kind of developmental research following children over time can yield all kinds of interesting and clinically relevant information. We can't establish causation. We can't say if we intervene on X, will that mean that there's a change in Y? But we certainly can generate a number of hypotheses suggesting that if you change X, Y might be associated with change. There might be associated change in Y as well. So I think that's very rich and useful information for people to follow up on as they think about developing interventions. I think one important message is that there is an opportunity to lower the age at which children with ASD get diagnosed. And there is evidence in the literature that the earlier there's a diagnosis, the better the long-term outcome. So we should redouble our efforts to identify children with ASD earlier, and that might mean focusing not on those kids or less on those kids with cognitive disability and language delay, but kids that aren't have better cognitive ability and good language skills, but still have a diagnosis of ASD. How can we be more sensitive to identifying those children earlier? Really, if there's one main message to the Pathways study, it's that individual children with ASD follow different paths. Doesn't matter what developmental domain you look at, you can find different developmental trajectories or pathways over time. And the implication of that is that each child with ASD needs a suite of interventions to address individual needs. One size fits all isn't going to work, and one intervention at a time focused on one target, skill, or ability isn't necessarily going to have spillover effects to other skills and abilities. Another important message is that the challenging behavior, which is so common in children with ASD, is not the main source of the mother's distress, that there are other sources of those distress we can think of, trying to get services of one sort or another, how to manage all the kids in the family, etc., etc. But it is very true that we need to integrate the needs of families into child services. We need interventions that will reduce parental distress, interventions that will provide social support to families and parents, and to teach helpful active coping skills. All too often, autism services don't provide those kinds of interventions and expect parents to get them elsewhere. And it's really important to have all that integrated into one sort of one-stop shop kind of package of interventions that are available for families as a whole. So here are the dates of the next two Pathways webinars. I hope we've piqued your interest sufficiently for you to attend the seminar on strengths and assets on June the 2nd, and another one on June the 9th, where we talk in more detail about mental health, risk, and resilience. And the final slide We want to make sure that we thank all the children, youth, and families who have participated in the Pathways study, the many research staff members and students and trainees that have been involved over the last 2 decades. Hard to believe that it's been almost 20 years since we've been doing the study. And it's great to report that the study team, with a couple of minor exceptions of folks who have retired, but everybody's stuck together. And in fact, we've grown so that there are now 13 investigators spread out all across the country who have participated in the Pathways study. So that's the end of the formal presentation, and I think we can move to the Q&A at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Slipmurray and Dr. Smith. There are a number of questions here, and here's my prompt to others to get your questions into the question box, and I'll start at the beginning. In light of the connection between fine motor skills and verbal abilities, would it be recommended to focus on fine motor skills in preschool-age children to support language development?
That's a great question, and it does suggest, those data do suggest that that would be a good strategy. It should not replace, of course, directly focusing on communication skills. But I think what it suggests is that an integrated comprehensive intervention package that promotes play skills, which would include fine motor skills, the ability to manipulate toys, to use tools, like utensils and so on. All of those sort of practical skills that engage fine motor skills would be an important part of the package that would promote communication in children with autism. We're in that study, we were looking at the subgroup of children who have the most delayed language, and those are the children who really are going to benefit from a comprehensive intervention. And yes, focusing on play skills is a piece of that.
Great, thank you. Second question, do you have any examples of the types of supports that were found to be most helpful? Practical parenting classes versus stress reduction workshops, perhaps?
In terms of supports, I think you're going to be looking at what an individual family needs, but informal social supports would include everything from a neighbor or friend you could talk to those sorts of parent groups that many autism organizations would offer, where parents can get together with other parents who have autistic children. But I think it's, there's no specific ideal support for any given family. I think it's more individualized than that. And it depends on the community you're in and what's available in your community. But it's just the availability of something that an individual family feels is supportive. That's the key.
Great, thanks. What are the informal parent supports versus the formal ones?
So as I've said, informal would refer to what's available to a family, either through their own network of friends and family, or in their own community on an informal level, sort of parent-taught get-togethers, those sorts of things, versus formalized services, through like a treatment agency or so forth.
Sarah asks, has your research shown that those diagnosed earlier do better?
Peter, why don't you take that? It's a complicated question.
It is a complicated question. And the reason it's complicated is because the notion of, quote, doing better, close quotes, is complicated. It's not simple. And I think what Isabel demonstrated, that you can do better on autism symptoms, but not necessarily also be doing better with respect to adaptive functioning. So we really have to define what domain we're talking about when we think about, quote, doing better. So that's, I think, point number one. I think the second point is that if we were to simply look at our kids who were diagnosed earlier, Do they have better functioning or fewer autistic symptoms later on? Well, not necessarily, because remember, those who were diagnosed earlier tended to have more severe cognitive disabilities and more language delay. And that'll put limits on the extent to which they can be doing better in those particular domains later on. But certainly the earlier you're diagnosed, the earlier you can get into a treatment program, and that will have a positive impact for sure on the parent's stress. And depending on how evidence-based the intervention is, will have an impact on the developmental outcome of the child with ASD. So while I think our study isn't a great way to answer your very good question, I think it does still point to the fact that we have a ways to go to lower that age of diagnosis, to take take advantage of the fact that parents are identifying these kids early, and that we can do a better job of at least getting those kids into a surveillance program of one sort or another.
And I'd just like to emphasize, as Peter mentioned, that the benefits of the earlier diagnosis shouldn't only be looked at in terms of the child's outcome, but on the benefits for families of receiving support earlier. Because I think that's something we do have very good evidence for.
Next question. Can you discuss how you will explore the transition to adulthood and how sample attrition may affect the findings?
So those are two excellent questions. Sample attrition is a problem with all longitudinal follow-up studies. And we spend many, let me assure you, we spend many sleepless nights worrying about sample attrition and how it affects our findings. I think generally speaking, we can say that sample attrition tends to occur early in the study during phase 1. Once you're in the study, you're sort of basically in the study. You don't then drop out. So you're more likely to drop out at time 1 or time 2 or time 3. Yes, it's true that those who have dropped out tend to be a little more severe in terms of either their symptoms. They tend to come from families with fewer resources, tend to be lone parent families. We don't find, however, that there's been a big impact on on the results, makes a big difference on the results if we just look at it in the ways in which they're available to us. Of course, we'd like 100% follow-up, and then we'd be more certain. But we're not too worried about the generalizability of our results after the attrition. I'll take the next one, if I may, about the transition to adulthood. Well, it's a great question, and we just had a conference call about this yesterday. We really, at this point, really feel it's extremely important to listen to those young people with ASD as to what their goals, hopes, and aspirations are for emerging adulthood. So we need to listen to the voices of people with ASD, and we've developed some really innovative methods to be able to do that, even with those who are minimally verbal. So our next task is to listen to those voices. What are the important accomplishments? What are the important things to aim for in this emerging adulthood transition? And then let's see if we can incorporate that into measurement in the next phase of our study.
Right.
Isabel, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And those who join the next webinar will hear a little more about some of those strategies for hearing the voices of the children in the study. And the other point I just make is that, although, attrition is a fact of life in developmental studies, our rate of retention actually compares really favorably with other studies that are comparably long. As Peter said, it's been 2 decades. So, we're really fortunate that families have stuck with us to the extent that they have.
Great. Stephen asks, what about the timing of supports to relieve parent stress? Close to diagnosis seems to be a time of higher need or stress for parents. Was this observed? And is there a sense that this might vary across provinces?
We have certainly looked at every time point at parental stress. And I think, again, families' needs evolve. So, at the time of diagnosis, certainly I think most families are in need of supports. And, those evolve over time in relation to, changes in the autistic child, changes in the family, changes in the services and resources available to them. I don't believe we've seen significant differences across sites in terms of family stress. I think we'd have to go back to the data, but I don't recall that being a significant difference across sites. Although the nature and availability of services varied across sites, that didn't appear to create big differences in terms of children's or families' experiences or outcomes. So that the timing of resources really needs to respond to the needs of families assessed at that time. I don't think we can make assumptions about what any given family will need at a particular time. We need to assess need and listen to families and listen to the youth themselves and find out what their needs are on an individual basis.
Anything to add, Peter?
No, I think that's beautifully spoken.
Wonderful. Jillian now asks, is there any information that supports sharing the research with parents regarding how stress or distress impacts parents' active engagement in reducing or decreasing stress or distress?
It's not something we've looked at directly in our study, but there certainly is literature supporting that if you teach people active coping strategies, that has benefits. So I mean, that's not just from the autism literature. I mean, I think there's very clear indications that you can teach these strategies to good effect. To both children and adults, and there's a variety of interventions available, to meet that need. I think that the big challenge is, the ready availability of these sorts of interventions in communities across the country. As Peter said, there's a tendency for autism services to be sort of delivered in isolation and not be connected to broader mental health services, broader family support services. And I think that's a disservice to families because those connections need to be there.
I'll just add, if I may, it's true we didn't share data on parent stress and coping, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
We did, however, share data at each data point on the kids' progress in their language ability, for example, or their other skills. Yeah. And that was a real motivator. Parents really appreciated seeing the progress of their child, seeing changes over time. So that sort of measurement-based care approach was quite useful. And in retrospect, I think we have regrets that we didn't do some of these things before. It would have been a great thing to share some of the data on stress over time with parents. We did it in a general aggregate way in our knowledge translation activities, but not a specific at the individual family level.
That said, certainly at our site, and I'm sure at other sites, there were lots of sort of informal conversations with families at the time that we got together with them and their children for Pathways visits. That and often we were responding to requests for connections with community supports and so on. So it wasn't it wasn't part of the research function, but all of us involved in this study are deeply committed to doing the best for the children and families, and to helping them establish connections to services that we know might be available for them.
I mean, I think the families develop very close relationships with the research staff because we always had the same person work with the family and the kid. And I think that was a real support for them anyway, in some ways. It was an important part of our ethos, as it were.
This next question is directed at Peter, but Isabel, feel free to jump in as well. You mentioned getting into a surveillance program. Could you describe what that entails, or is that too individualized or subject to regional availability?
In a word, yes. So here's the story as I understand it, and Isabel's done some great work in this area too. But I think the ability of structured screening tools that are currently out there and available that you might want to give on a universal basis to everyone in the population or even to high-risk groups just aren't good enough. They're not sensitive enough to pick up the emerging signs of ASD in kids. So, having said that, it doesn't mean that we should give up, but instead, we should be very sensitive to kids that have at-risk markers, pre-diagnosis, and that family doctors and pediatricians need to be better educated on what some of these early emerging signs might be. So as they're doing well baby visits or early childhood visits as part of routine care or vaccinations, they can routinely inquire about these early signs and symptoms that are risk and might predict an ASD diagnosis. And if they do find them, to then act upon them and institute a more formal diagnostic assessment.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add that in one of the early slides, Peter made reference to the Canadian Pediatric Society guidelines for surveillance and screening that came out in 2019, and so that's a great document for physicians to use as a resource. And also, the other need is for increased awareness among childcare, early childhood educators, childcare providers, others who deliver services to families of young children, for them to be aware and to help families nudge families towards assessment if they're concerned about signs of early autism.
Great. I'm about to put into the chat the link to that CPS document.
Thank you.
Next question. Do you have any data to show if there's a difference between in-person supports or virtual supports in light of the pandemic? Is there a difference in effectiveness?
We personally, the Pathway study does not have such data. There's been a real groundswell of published research now, though, on the provision of virtual supports. And, there is the lovely Canadian work on early intervention for young children with autism from our colleague, Dr. Jessica Bryan at Holland Bloorview in Ontario, who's developed a virtual version of an early intervention for toddlers with signs of autism, in which, the early results anyway appear to be just as positive for the virtually delivered intervention as for the in-person intervention. And this is a parent coaching intervention. And so, there are a number of different interventions that are now being delivered virtually, a lot of data being published, and, most of it looks pretty reassuring. My guess is that there are going to be individual differences in people's responsiveness to virtual versus in-person interventions. There are some for whom it might actually be a better mechanism, more accessible, and there may be others who benefit more from in person. But overall, my impression is that the results look quite positive. I don't know, Peter, if that's something you've been tracking in the literature as well.
Yeah, I don't know about definitive studies that have come out in the literature yet. It's going to take years for us
Yeah,
to figure out what the impact of this pandemic has been on
yeah,
not only the mental health of children with ASD, but
yeah.
children in general. I can tell you anecdotally, some kids with ASD, because they didn't have to go to school and school was a stressful environment for them, they were actually, their stress level was a little bit better being at home. Other kids with a lack of structure, they found it much more difficult. So we are collecting data on the impact of the
Mm,
pandemic on the kids. So we'll be
mm,
able to have a look at that. Um, and I agree with Isabel. I think
mm,
the virtual care is a game changer.
mm,
Everybody pivoted to virtual care successfully. By and large, everybody feels good about it. So I think it's now we have to refine it.
yeah.
You know, who's it good for what particular reason, at what point in time,
Yeah,
and I think that'll be an important goal for the next couple of years.
it's all in the details, as they say.
Yeah.
And what appears to be our last question is your study involved children with autism in large cities where autism spectrum disorder services are readily available. If the outcome would the outcome be the same, do you think, in a smaller, rural, more isolated settings, age of diagnosis, parental stress, child health outcomes, etc.? I guess part of that can be alleviated through virtual care. But what do you think
Mhm.
the outcomes would be in more isolated or rural centers?
Um, it's a really interesting question. Not all of the families in the study actually live in metropolitan centers. So, for example, in the children who stemmed from the Halifax site, some of them lived in more rural parts of Nova Scotia, including a number of families who actually lived in Cape Breton, and we traveled to see them. And I believe that in some of the other provinces, that the children, although they were assessed at a regional center, they lived outside the cities. It's not something we have looked at in our data, so I don't think we're really in a position to address that. What we did attempt to look at was the services that families accessed and what the effects of services were. It turns out to be very, very difficult to quantify the type and level of service that families received when their children were young, and to tie any particular outcomes to those services. That's probably been one of the tougher parts of the study, I think, is like looking back now, could we have measured services in a different way that it would have allowed us to make more definitive statements about what was most effective for in producing change for families. But I don't think we can really address the question that was asked, although it's a really important one. Peter?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and
Yeah.
it makes me think that we should go back and look at rural urban differences in outcome and so forth. So
Yeah.
thanks for the tip, whoever whoever get it.
Always more work to do.
Yes.
Well, that appears to be the end of our time today. So thank you, Peter and Isabel, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you all our members and attendees for choosing to join us. We know how busy you are right now, and we hope you depart with some practical knowledge to take back to your organization. Join us on June 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern when we are going to bring you part 2 in this Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder series, Strengths and Assets from Multiple Perspectives. We also invite you to save the date for our 2021 annual conference taking place virtually from November 22nd to 26th this year. The theme is From Crisis to Catalyst, the next chapter for children's healthcare. And the call for abstracts for posters and member spotlight sessions is open until June 13th. It's always great if you can watch our webinars live, as your questions and comments really enrich the discussion. But if you can't, the recordings of these sessions are made available after the fact on our Knowledge Exchange Network. So thanks again for joining us today. Thank you to Peter and Isabel and the Pathways in Autism Spectrum Disorder study team for this presentation, and hopefully we'll see many of you back here on June 2nd for part 2. Bye, everyone.